All right, awesome. Everyone on the webinar, thank you so much. Thank you so much for attending. My name's Abhishek. I sit on the customer success team here at mParticle. And before I dive into introducing our speaker and the content, I just want to quickly call out some ground rules. This podcast is going to be recorded, so we'll definitely send a copy of the recorded link out after the live session. Please ask questions, by the way, throughout the whole presentation. We do have a Q&A lined up at the end of, the content section to go over. And then if you have any issues with sound or audio or video in any way, please do reach out over the Zoom chat. We do have kind of a set of moderators that can help us out. So with that, I am so excited to introduce Jody Bernardini. Jody is one of our enterprise solutions architects at mParticle, and he works hand in hand with some of our largest and most complex enterprise customers across a number of verticals and geographies. And in particular, Jody helps these organizations define their customer data strategy and data architecture. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Jody, to kick things off.
Awesome, and thanks for that warm intro, Abhi. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm here to talk to you about building a first-party data strategy. So let's just jump right into it. And I want to start off by talking about the elephant in the room here. And it's why are we talking about first-party data and not third-party data? And frankly, it's just because third-party data, it's on its way out. But hey, that's not a bad thing, right? Because this allows us to shift to our focus to like a much better, like much higher quality first-party data. So for me, whenever I think of third-party data, I always picture this kind of hazy, unclear, this kind of nebulous cloud of information. It's usually the stale, conflicting, it's out of date, and it's generally just not trustworthy. So you can get multiple values for the same fields. You can get data that you're probably not even interested in. So for example, for me, I actually looked myself up in a DMP registry tool, and I just wanted to see what segments and audiences that I was a part of. And I found out that the DMP listed me as both married and single. I belong to multiple household income brackets, and I'm both simultaneously the male and female head of my household. So my point here is that I wouldn't really use the word accurate to describe this data. Now, if we compare that to first-party data, hey, this is info we're getting straight from our end users, straight from our users that are using our applications. We know exactly who they are, we know the actions they've taken, the products they've viewed, and we can enable much better interactions with our customers with this data. With this type of kind of trustworthy data that we're gathering, we can spend more time creating unique experiences for our users that we know will be of interest to them. So when I talk about unique and kind of meaningful experiences, when I was a kid, I worked in a pizzeria. So I make a lot of pizza analogies, so bear with me on this. But who doesn't love pizza, right? Well, imagine going to your local pizzeria in person and consistently ordering the same thing. Let's say you consistently go into your pizzeria and you order a vegetarian pizza. After a couple of visits, the staff there, they're probably going to recognize you and say, hey, it's that vegetarian pizza person, right? You want your usual? And that's going to create a unique experience for you. And having been on both sides of the counter in this interaction, I can tell you people love this kind of interaction. You have a sense of rapport with the staff. They know who you are. They know what you like. And it makes you feel special as a customer. It gives you that feel special moment with the business. And because they know you, they're not going to suggest something to you that doesn't interest you. They're not going to suggest like a meat lover's pie, for instance, even if that's their best seller, even if they sell out of that every day, because that's not what you as an individual customer would be there for. So why would we handle our data any differently, right? If we focus with first-party data, we can tie behavioral data to unique users. And with that, we can create more of those feel special moments. And the best thing is we can do that at scale across all of our customers simultaneously. The key is that we want to ensure we're reaching out to users with content that's actually interesting to them. So taking a look at the workflows on this slide, we can see on the top, we're looking at an aggregate data workflow. For instance, a customer opens your app, the app determines what content to load by calling a backend recommendation engine. If that engine only has aggregate data, it's always only going to show the most popular items for all users with nothing catered to the individual user. As a result, your users might scroll by because the content may or may not be relevant to them. Now, if we look at the first-party data flow on the bottom, We follow the same exact steps, except this time when we call that recommendation engine, it's going to know who I am. It's going to know what I've previously purchased, what I've viewed, and so on. And with that kind of data, we can show the user much better content like, hey, pick up where you left off, or reorder your favorite meal again, or hey, because you ordered X, we think you might like Y as well. Point is, with this kind of first-party data, we can generate unique recommendations. We can create segmentations of users based off of actions that we know they've definitely taken with our app. And one point that I really can't stress enough on this is you can't make an individual user feel special with aggregate data. And that's really what this is all about. And having said that, we haven't even touched on the privacy aspect of this yet. GDPR and CCPA regulations have introduced restrictions that on how data can be shared. And realistically, there's no practical way to know if third-party data had been collected with or without appropriate consent. So this has resulted in a requirement to build more of a first-party relationship with your users instead of relying on that third-party supplemental info. And this is something we really just can't brush off, right? Because if we ignore this, well, one, it can result in regulatory implications. But beyond that, we want happy customers, right? If a user tries to opt out of marketing communications and we continue to message them and target them, they're really just not going to be happy. So when we collect first-party data, we can directly ask our users for consent. And then, if they don't, then we can respect their wishes and, they can opt out. So moving on, I think at this point, we have a couple of good reasons about why first-party data is important, but I really want to dive into how we implement the first-party data strategy. And really that starts with the user's journey. When we track first-party data, we gain extremely useful, insightful information about the user, right? So the more user visits, the more we learn about them. We can trace our user's journey from, hey, their first visit to their first purchase, to when they registered and became a converted user, a loyal user of ours. And you can see how step by step we build up this information about the user, which gives us a much more holistic view into who they are, why they're here, what they're interested in, and so forth. So let's follow the user's journey here, right? And let's imagine that I am running a retail clothing store, for example. At step one, a new user downloads our app, and we can see when a user first visits, we have really little information about them besides knowing that, hey, a new device has opened up our application. But then moving into step two, after the installation, the user might click around, they might view some products, and we can start building a picture about who the user is and what they're interested in. For example, let's say we have a user that keeps viewing things like fitness shorts, running shoes, athletic tees, and so on. I might tag that user as interested in activewear, or I might put them in an activewear audience solely based on their browsing activity. And with that, at this point, I could potentially send a push notification to that user when a new piece of activewear becomes available. When I have a new content drop, I could just say, hey, you might be interested in this. And then moving on to step three, hey, here's where the user makes a purchase as a guest, and boom, that's where our image of the user really, really starts coming together, right? Even if they haven't registered, even if they don't have an account with us, they check out as a guest, we still know, hey, we have their interest, we have purchase history, we have some user details about them to get in touch, right? With that kind of data, we might consider the types of campaigns that we can run. And for example, like as a retail clothing store, I might want to get my users now to register for an account. Referencing all the data we've collected at this point, we could generate a list of users that have, hey, anybody that's made a purchase but is not registered yet. And then I can target those users with an email, with a push and say, hey, save on your next purchase, register for an account now, and you can get 10% off your next order. And that takes us on to step four, right? If let's say our campaign worked here, right? We got the user to create an account, we get really solid information about them. Maybe, as through the registration workflow, we got their date of birth, their location, so on. But more importantly, hopefully we've converted this user into a long-term loyal customer. So now I have a really, really clear picture of this user. I have multiple ways to contact them. I have metadata about that user. I have a bunch of behavioral information about them and their purchase history. Having all this data at my fingertips now really unlocks just tons of potential for creating those unique engagements. I can do more personalization and dive into all those things that I've been talking about in the previous slides. But hey, one thing I really, really want to highlight here is that the data collection doesn't stop here. again, the more a user interacts with us, the more we learn. And we want to continue learning more and more about that user and their interests because, hey, as time goes on, their interests might change. Our store catalog might change over time with seasons, with trends, et cetera. So the important thing is that me, as a retail clothing store in this scenario, that I can stay on top of this and stay ahead of the game here. So I've been talking a lot about the vision, about the customer journey, but if you're a data nerd like me, you're probably going to want to dive into an example of the actual data that we might be collecting about this user. So let's talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts about what we're actually collecting and what we're generating from the customer. And this is where data modeling really comes into play. When we talk about data models, what I mean when I say that is really a set of expectations about the size, the extent, the shape of the data that we want to collect. So in other words, we want a source of truth for the kind of user metadata as well as the actions that we want to track. We also want to go as far as to specify, the metadata that we want to collect within those actions as well. So take the example here. We can see that when a user performs any kind of add to cart action, we expect specific information to be collected along with that action, right? We want to know not just that they added to cart, but we want to know what they added to cart. We want to know the product name, we want to know the product ID, the price, so on. Then take that a step further and think about, hey, what should the format of that data be? Things like, hey, product name should probably be a string. Price, that should probably be a number, things like that. So at a high level, it's as simple as saying, hey, we want to collect users, we want to collect data from users anytime they view a page or a product, every time they add to cart or purchase or remove from cart, et cetera. Every time they perform, X action, where X can be anything unique in your app. We want this to be really specific as possible, really, because we want to set guidance on how we capture that data, along with the names and types of the data that we collect in those actions. Because, if we're really clear and concise in this data modeling, using that data becomes consistent, becomes easy to use, and it makes it a much easier life for the actual utilization here. So moving on, when we start building data models, we talk to our customers about approaching this from two angles, really. One, we want to look at what data is actually available. There's no point trying to collect something that doesn't exist in your application. And two, we want to consider what data we need to achieve our goals. In other words, what are the use cases we're trying to achieve and what data do we need for those use cases to be successful? So here I like to take a step back and think about what outcomes we want to achieve here. So for example, let's say that in this workflow, I own a coffee shop, and one of my goals is to increase retention. To do that, I might want to try to better reward my loyal users. To achieve that, I might want to focus on the relevant info for rewarding my users. Like if somebody orders a coffee, for example, I don't need to know who the barista was. I don't need to know what machine was used. Even if that data is available for me, it's not useful in my use case. But what I do want to know is which customer made what purchase, how many of them, and then with that data, I can do all sorts of things, right? I can create a list of users that have made more than 5 purchases in the last 2 weeks, for example. And then maybe if they have, I can grant them a free coffee. Better yet, I could give them a tailored experience. So in the example here, I can see somebody ordered 5 cortados. Maybe I can send them something like, hey, Jody, we appreciate you. You're a great customer. Your next cortado is on us. The key here is to understand what we want to do with the data, right? It always comes back to the use cases and what we want to achieve. And one thing I always tell my customers is really don't get distracted about the amount of data, the quantity of data that's available. Instead, focus more on what will allow you to deliver the engagements that you want to create, right? So you have to figure out what's important for that. It can be easy, for any kind of retail company, it's always easy to start off with a purchase. Thinking about what data do we need to know about our purchases, capture that, write that down, take a step back from there and say, hey, what actions lead up to that purchase? What data can we leverage in those steps that lead up to that purchase? Capture those, write those down as well. These are all the behaviors that we want to understand about our users. This is what will allow us to really lock in on their likes and their dislikes and get a better understanding about who they are and what they're really looking for. So when you have a solid idea of the outcomes you want, honing in on the correct data to capture, that's an easy part. So next, I really want to focus on why creating this model is such an important step. And the first thing to talk about is consistency. One thing our data model can introduce is a consistent naming convention. This is really, really important. We want to create a model that allows us to receive data across all of our data sources consistently, whether it be web or mobile, in-store actions, whatever. We want this to be consistent across the board because it makes it much easier to leverage that data later on, right? We don't want to take time to think about, hey, well, our iOS app calls it a purchase, but our Android app calls it a transaction. No, none of that. We want to nip that in the bud, right? We want to spend less time fighting with our data and accounting for these inconsistencies, spend a lot more time leveraging it. The second thing is data quality. When we model our data, we're not only looking at normalizing the naming conventions, but we can also stipulate what we expect that data to look like. What's the data type? Is it a string? Is it a number, Boolean? We consider not only what the data is named, but also what it should contain. We can get ahead of bad data that's either missing values or is in the wrong format. We can immediately call that out if it doesn't fit our guidelines. So take a look at the example here. When a customer orders a coffee, whether or not the order contained milk or not, that needs to be a Boolean value. That's a yes or no question. There's no other option here. If we receive null for milk, imagine a customer going into a shop, hey, do you want coffee? No, like that doesn't happen in real life. So if we receive that null value, we know something went wrong and we can immediately flag that rather than sending that bad data back downstream, because that might end up erroring out one of our marketing tools downstream and cause issues. So really it's all about creating that data model, making sure we have consistent naming conventions and making sure we get ahead of bad data. And underlining the importance of data modeling, that really brings us to the next section of the presentation here. And that's the do's and don'ts of data modeling. So the first thing that I really want to focus on in this section is focusing on outcomes. I mean, we've talked about this already, but time and time again, when customers come to mParticle and they first start modeling their data, we always ask, what data do you think is important to capture? And more often than not, we hear back, oh, well, let's just capture everything, right? It's easier just to say capture everything. But, and it might sound a little counterintuitive, that's not always a great idea because more data doesn't mean better engagement. In fact, we see a lot of our customers in mParticle only use a very small portion of the data that they actually collect, when they're doing targeting and paid media campaigns and they're building audiences in our platform. The rest of the data just goes unused, and it goes unused and unmaintained is more important. I don't want to say that the kind of unused and unmaintained data pollutes your good data, but it does distract from it. We want to focus on what's useful. We want to invest in that data planning upfront from the start. We want to avoid figuring things out as we go and just kind of capturing data blindly. Because when we try to capture everything, that leads to needing to maintain everything as well. And it's just a massive waste of resources. So I'd say I would urge all customers, any prospects, tie your data capture to value and don't spread yourselves too thin. Don't focus on a kind of quantity over quality mindset of capturing data. And the next do and don't, we want really at a high level, we want our naming conventions to be fairly generic. This allows us to kind of start big and narrow things down with metadata. If we're able to look at, let's say we're looking at this view video event and we want the actual video to be called, we want the actual event to be called view video. And then we'd have metadata describing things such as, hey, this is the episode, this is the season, this is where the source was, this was the title, etc. That can all be metadata. We don't want the event names to be too specific because look at the example on the right. Every video viewed is a unique event here. They have, if you're watching season 2, episode 1, if you're watching season 2, episode 2, these are all unique events. But imagine if we wanted to get a list of all users that have viewed any video in the past week. We need to find all users that have viewed season 1, episode 1, viewed season 1, episode 2, episode 3, episode 4, viewed season 2, etc., etc. We need to do that not across all seasons, but across all titles as well. It requires us to stitch all of this data together because at a high level, our naming convention was way too granular. And that's just going to be way too tedious to maintain. And it's going to result in a list of unique events that is just impossible to deal with. So with a good broad naming convention, we can simply say, hey, calculate a list of users that have done any view video event from the example on the left. And if we want to go more granular, we can filter on those event attributes. We can filter on that metadata. For example, we could calculate all users that have done a view video event where the source of that page was recently watched. And we can then see how useful that recently watched page was. It just makes things super clean and really time efficient for the marketers. Next up, speaking of naming conventions, we want these to be intuitive and consistent. And when I say consistent, I mean it should be the same across all platforms, across all app builds, and so on. We don't want to receive the same action from iOS and Android with different names, because like I said before, if iOS calls it a purchase, Android calls it a transaction, we're going to need to account for that difference later. We're going to need to stitch that data together somehow. We also want to make sure that the names, they make sense and they're human readable. And that's for a variety of reasons. The more intuitive it is, the easier it is to use, the less we need to explain it. It makes it a lot less error prone. So looking at the example on the left, I don't really need an explanation for that. I can see what's being collected, right? But looking at the example on the right, I would need some kind of reference documentation to translate it and explain what we're capturing. Imagine new people are coming into your business and trying to leverage that data. It just makes it really difficult. So the next one is more, the next do and don't is more of a don't focus, which is don't build around one application and don't hold on to bad naming conventions for legacy reasons. So when we build around one application, let's say that you're only forwarding data into one tool, into one platform, you might think that what you're forwarding to that one application is the most important thing or is the only important thing. But what's happening is you're forcing yourself to build into that application's data model, not creating your own. And you're not considering what's usable and acceptable. Sorry, you're not considering what you deem important and what you want to use. It's only what's usable and acceptable in that app. So when you build around one application, not only you're building to their data model, but it really kind of locks you into that one application as well. And, you know, in the future, down the line, if you want to move off of that application, it might be difficult because you're stuck in their naming conventions. And along a similar vein, if you already have some naming conventions in place, really, I would stress not to hold on to them for legacy reasons. You know, develop a plan to move off of legacy data, even if you need to maintain two things simultaneously, because in the future, you'll thank yourself for the versatility of being able to leverage the data the way you want to leverage the data, not by how one application wants to leverage it. And the final do and don't that I have on this is enforce your data model. So at this point, if we're at this point in the presentation, we've spent a lot of time and effort to build a good model. But honestly, that won't mean a single thing if you let messy, unorganized, and worst of all, if you let wrong data slip through the cracks. What's the whole point of data modeling? So on the left, we can see that, you know, episode has been misspelled. So we want to highlight that. We want to block it, or we want to fix it. Looking at the data on the right, I mean, talk to anybody in your marketing teams or your analytics teams, nobody would be happy receiving this kind of data. So make sure you use your data model to guide your implementations. Make sure you use it to guide your data collection, and really don't be afraid to be strict when you do see bad data. And I've said this to customers plenty of times. It's better to have less data than to have wrong data. And finally, to wrap this all up, I just want to highlight the perks of what building this first-party data strategy can unlock for you. I mean, we spent time on this in previous slides going through the examples, but to drive it all home, really adopting a first-party data mindset, being thoughtful about your data model, we can see tons of benefits throughout your customer's journey. Example, during acquisition, we can see direct actions that lead up to conversions. And, you know, we can probably even get better measurement on how successful the campaigns we're running actually are. Moving into things like retention, you know, first-party data modeling, it comes down to understanding our users better, respecting their privacy, and then uniquely engaging with them, uniquely rewarding them, right? That's going to lead to happy customers. And I always like to say, happy customers always lead to positive reviews. Positive reviews lead to referrals, and that ties really nicely back into your acquisition as well. Last but not least is my favorite is the personalization, because with a good set of first-party data, that's where we can really increase the relevancy of the content, relevancy of the experiences that we deliver to our users. And really, for me, it's about driving those kind of feel special moments we can create within our applications. And that's really the coolest part of it for me. But with that, hey, that's all I have for today. Thanks for taking the time to listen in. I'm going to kick it back over to Avi now.
Awesome. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Jody. And yes, for everyone that can stick around, we're gonna take some Q&A now. Of course, please continue and feel free if anything comes to mind to keep asking. And Jody, of course, I want to be fair to you. I hope it's okay, but I thought I'd throw out a few of the audience's questions for you today.
Of course, yeah, more than happy to.
Amazing. All right, so the first thing I want to kick off with, and it's probably top of mind for everyone, right? I mean, this whole first-party data strategy. It's great. I think there's a lot of value, and you kind of explained why that's valuable in the presentation today. But practically, one of the questions that came up is how long does it take typically to build a first-party data strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm hesitant to give any finite response on this, and that's really because it depends on the business, right? It depends on what you're currently working from and what you're trying to achieve. A lot of times when we're building a first-party data strategy, when we're building these kind of data models, we need to engage in a lot of different parts of the business. Well, one, we need to start with buy-in, right? We need executive buy-in to kind of transform the data that we're capturing. And then we need to kind of understand what we need to capture. So we might start engaging with, say, data engineers, we might engage with marketers, we might engage with product managers. And then finally, we need to engage with the engineers in our customers' organizations as well to make sure that, hey, that data that we're trying to capture is actually available. So, hey, to answer this question quickly, it can take anywhere. I've seen customers do this as quickly as a couple of weeks, but I've also seen customers do this at a much slower pace because they were very kind of concise about what the data they wanted to capture was and needed to engage at different parts of the organization in order to make sure that that could come to fruition, really.
Awesome. And I think this kind of segues nicely into, and I know none of us can really predict the future, or clairvoyant on where this is all heading. But Jody, from your experience working with some of our largest customers, if I'm a data-driven marketer or a professional thinking about my data strategy holistically for my organization, what are some things around the corner or things that you see coming up in the future of the data landscape and the privacy landscape that I should keep in mind looking forward?
Yeah, and I would say that's a really good question. It's the timing of this is really important because take a look around at what's happening. Even leading up to this, GDPR and CCPA regulations, right? Not being able to share third-party data without consent, right? Take a look at what Apple's been doing with ATT. Look at what Facebook and TikTok have recently announced with not being able to share device-level data across advertisers, right? It's becoming more and more important. And I think it's going to continue to become more and more important to have more of a first-party relationship with our users, to create more of, now's the time to create more of a walled garden where we know who our users are, we know a lot of good information about them, we contain that within ourselves, and we can create, we know what the users are doing with their applications, so we don't need to grab that data from other vendors, right? If we model our data appropriately, now is the time to start thinking about this data strategy, because if we're not getting ahead of it now, more and more things are going to come, things like ATT, things like Facebook and TikTok dropping device AMM. That's going to prevent you from being able to share this data easily, and it's going to force you to need to collect this kind of data yourselves. And if you don't really want to be on the back foot of this and realize that you're not getting this data too late, right?
Yeah, and kind of 2 points on that, right? One is, if it's not regulations and giant, some of these walled gardens actually quite literally forcing or taking away certain data sets that you were able to get, there's kind of the compliance and regulatory reasons, even if this data was available, that you wouldn't want to collect it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think I have one more for you, Jody, before we let you go. And you hit on this a little bit, right, when you were talking about data modeling, and I think for me personally, I can't stress this enough. It's maintaining, a high quality data model and enforcing it. One of the questions we got from the audience is, where is the best place to define and enforce my marketing data model? And then are there any tools you would suggest that work well from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can quick plug for mParticle here, because we do have a data planning and validation tool within our platform, right? And I think this is an important part of what a CDP can bring to the table, is being able to pull that data together and then, validate or block that data as we receive it and make sure we're not polluting things downstream, right? But, that being said, there are other options out there. I have seen other customers that, hey, before mParticle had a data planning tool, they could forward this data to an analytics tool. We could forward it to a webhook that might bounce the kind of schema of what they're expecting against the schema of what they're receiving, the payloads of what they're receiving, versus kind of like a schema of data of what they're expecting. And a lot of times, the easiest things to call out are like typecasting. Hey, we're forwarding a number and we're expecting it to be a string. We're getting no values for this. We're expecting it to be a value, things like that. But it's pretty much about, I've seen customers do this with as simple as an Excel spreadsheet and then looking at their data in an analytics tool and saying like, hey, this was supposed to come in under this value, but it's coming in under this value. So it really depends on how manual you want that to be. But certainly, mParticle's data planning and validation tool does make it very easy to get ahead of it, flag it, block it, and decide what to do with that bad data.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, Jody, we wouldn't hold you up too much longer. Thank you so much for answering some of the questions. And then, of course, for everyone that attended today, thank you so much for joining and tuning in and listening. That's a wrap, and we will be following up shortly with a recording. So more to come. Awesome.
Thanks all.
Take care, everyone.